Hello there. Welcome to Wake Up to the Bible. I'm Daniel Kaplan. I'm here with my father, Dr. Kaplan. Together, we're going to be reading from Genesis to Deuteronomy over the course of this year. We're doing a little portion every day based on the traditional Jewish portions. This is the seventh reading for this week, Genesis 17:7 through 27. We're going to be reading from the Robert Alter translation. All right, let's get started. And I will establish my covenant between me and your seed after you through their generations as an everlasting covenant to God, to you and to your seed after you. And I will give unto you and your seed after you the land in which you sojourn, the whole land of Canaan, as an everlasting holding, and I will be their God. And God said to Abraham, As for you, you shall keep my commandment, you and your seed after you through their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your seed after you. Each male among you must be circumcised. You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. 8 days old, every male among you shall be circumcised through your generations, even slaves born in the household, and for those purchased with silver from any foreigner who is not of your seed. Those born in your household and those purchased with silver must be circumcised, and my covenant in your flesh shall be an everlasting covenant. And a male with a foreskin who has not circumcised the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his folk. My covenant he has broken. And God said to Abraham, Sarai, your wife, shall no longer be called her name Sarai, for Sarah is her name. And I will bless her, and I will also give you from her a son, and I will bless him, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall issue from her. And Abraham flung himself on his face, and he laughed, saying to himself, To 100-year-old will a child be born? Will 90-year-old Sarah give birth? And Abraham said to God, Would that Ishmael might live in your favor. And God said, Yet Sarah your wife is to bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his seed after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Look, I will bless him and make him fruitful, and will multiply him most abundantly. 12 chieftains he shall beget, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear you by this season next year. And he finished speaking with him, and God ascended from Abraham. And Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all the slaves born in his household, and those purchased with silver, every male among the people of Abraham's household. And he circumcised the flesh of their foreskin on that day as God had spoken to him. And Abraham was 90 years old when the flesh of his foreskin was circumcised. Oh, sorry, 99. When the flesh of his foreskin was circumcised. And Ishmael his son was 13 years old when the flesh of his foreskin was circumcised. On that very day, Abraham was circumcised, and Ishmael his son, and all the men of his household, those born in the household, and those who purchased with silver from the foreigners, were circumcised with him. All right, so, yes, we have. A passage about making sure you have enough skin in the game, as it were, or maybe too much skin in the game. I don't know. But go ahead, sir, and you can go ahead and talk about circumcision.
So here we have Brit Milah, we have the covenant of circumcision. It would seem that from a health point of view, safely, you circumcise the child as soon as it is safe to do so. So 8 days are allowed, and this is understood to be on the eighth day. And evidently, this would be the earliest possible time to do it for the health of the child. Although there is significance to the number eight. In a sense, seven is God's number of completeness, and eight is even beyond that, like abundance. So the child is maybe physically complete in a week, and then even the extra part is on the eighth day. Now it's interesting. Ishmael is circumcised at 13. In Jewish tradition, in recent centuries, a boy becomes responsible for his behavior when he's 13. Um, it may be that circumcision already was being practiced in some ways. Obviously, he doesn't really define it here, but on the other hand, too, the Bible wouldn't be the place to to get into the details of it. You know, we, So, but there are peoples that do it. That, for example, in Africa, there's a tribe that waits till you're 20, and they do it then. And nowadays they go to the hospital. I guess in the earlier times they would have just done it locally, but now they do go to the hospital. This is a tribe in Kenya. So the question is, why some of these practices were there and so widespread. But that's a question that for another day maybe.
Um, yeah. One thing that was noted that Robert Alter pulls out, which I think is very smart, is that the way this started out, like weekly portion at least pretty much was talking about the sacrificial, and then there's a lot of slicing and stuff like that, and then we have this fleshly surgical procedure as well. So it does tie in the whole covenant, you know, in terms of that there is there is like a cost, right? There's a cost to it, and it's even a bit of yourself. And the fact too that this directly ties into what's going to come next, which is, yes, you will bear a son, and in order to kind of prepare him, he has to go through this surgical procedure. It's falling into covenant about the fact that procreation itself is in the hands of God, and it all, ties together very beautifully.
This is in effect a preparation for marriage. It's done when the child is young. That's a much more merciful time to do it. It's much more difficult for an adult. But once this is done, the child is now eligible later to beget offspring, and so he becomes kind of a potential groom. And you'll see this later on. And I suppose that's why perhaps that Kenyan tribe does it when they're 20. Maybe they do it right before they take a wife. Um, there was more. Yes, I would like to mention that uh, the circumcision is, in a certain sense, a sacrificial ritual, and in the Old Testament, it enabled you to fully participate in the sacrificial system. Or if you were a woman, you would have an elder brother or husband or father who was circumcised. So you could then participate fully in the sacrificial system. So circumcision was necessary as part of the sacrificial system. Now that doesn't carry over to the New Testament because Jesus Christ is your sacrifice, and nor does it carry over for non-Jewish people in the New Testament because it was tied in with a promise of a specific land that was going to be given to Abraham's descendants because they had a certain role to play in God's plan as a nation. And so the circumcision was indicative, on the eighth day was indicative that we are the people who are going to have this land and we're going to play a certain role in the world. Again, that does not apply to non-Israelites, in my opinion. So what I'm trying to say is, as the Apostle Paul pleaded with Galatians, that for Gentiles under the new covenant, circumcision is not a requirement.
There's an interesting piece here that we'll play into later, so we're going to kind of go into spoiler territory for those of you who haven't read the Bible before. But and if you haven't, that's fine. Don't feel bad. You can follow along with us, and you'll get through it. So it's great. Um, when Abraham is saying, would that Ishmael live in your favor? It's interesting because his initial reaction again is, this is so humorous. How's this going to happen to me? It's essentially, why don't you just work with Ishmael? But later, and to me that shows so much compassion for Ishmael and for Hagar and everything, considering the circumstance of which what happened, and all of that family drama. But on the other hand, later, God is going to bring up Isaac, and he's going to say, take your son, your only son that you love, and it's almost like at that point Ishmael is a little bit out of the picture. So it is just kind of interesting. I don't I don't know exactly what to make of that offhand. To me it seems like perhaps at this point in his life Abraham thinks of Ishmael a little bit differently than he's going to be thinking about him once Isaac comes around. I don't know. What are your thoughts when you think about that? And specifically the relationship that Abraham had with Ishmael throughout all this?
Well, ultimately, Abraham realized that the That's the spiritual promises are going to come through Isaac. So once Isaac is born, that does become very critical to Abraham. That the spiritual promises, through, particularly like the messianic promise that's implied in Genesis 12:3, that is going to come through Isaac. Uh, I would like to say again, as far as names, Yitzchak, he will laugh. So once again, he laughed. So it is a laughing matter to have a son, when you're so old and now you finally have the promise. So you laugh, enjoy, but also it's a way of God saying, you laughed, but I can do it. You laughed at the possibility, but yet I did it. So maybe that's, like a double meaning there. And I would like to say that taking a little bit of flesh off there when you circumcise is in a way symbolic of overcoming the flesh, and it's symbolic of repentance. In Deuteronomy 10:16, God says, therefore circumcise the foreskin of your heart and be stiff-necked no longer. And Paul in Romans 2 speaks about circumcision not of the flesh, but of the inner being.
Mm-hmm.
So circumcision is a type of repentance. And one other thing is that the day that this was done was evidently the first day of unleavened bread, and we'll see that later on. I'll come back to that.
Mm-hmm.
But evidently, this from this date of Abraham's circumcision, you go 430 years, and you have the Exodus.
The Exodus from Egypt.
You go from 1877 to 1447. You go 430 years from the circumcision of Abraham to the outgoing of Egypt, to the first day of unleavened bread as they left Egypt. And I'll say more about that. I'll tie it all together as we go along.
That's really profound, especially considering the whole Exodus of Egypt. I like that. I don't even remember you ever mentioning that before. You probably have, and I just didn't pay attention. So you were talking about Isaac, the name, and he laughed. I like how Robert Alter goes into the verb, because he says the meanings include joyous laughter, bitter laughter, mockery, and even sexual pleasure. It's like it does have a lot blended in there in that concept, and we'll get to that later, where the Bible plays with the name Isaac in terms of those different meanings. One thing that I was noticing is to what we were talking about a little while ago, if in terms of slaves, is that the fact that even your servants and your indentured servants or whoever you have under a contract, all of those people have to be circumcised, is, you might think, well, that's kind of robbing them of individual rights. But on the other hand, I think what it actually is doing is saying that they are, in fact, human beings just like you. They are not property in a sense. It's a way to, if you think that God had to work with that system until eventually he could dismantle it, it's at least a stepping stone to begin that process of, treating people equally.
And it also prepares them to accept upon themselves the responsibility to obey God fully. Once the Sinaitic covenant is given and the rules are given, the circumcised Gentile servant, if he wants to, can eventually accept upon himself the Ol Malchut Shamayim, the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, and become a full-fledged Israelite. And then eventually that would mean he could be free from his servitude.
And just from a just from a more pronomian perspective or commandment keeping perspective, I think it's just helpful to know that throughout the whole journey, you have God deliberately working with people that are not necessarily completely in his sphere, so, or not particularly Jewish, because I think a lot of people, every time, laws or principles are brought in, they're like, oh, that was for, the Jewish people. But throughout the text, you're going to see it as we go through. They're constantly mentioning of the foreigners among you, the other people, and everything. They're this ultimate separation, which is dealt with completely in the New Testament time frame of, breaking down those barriers. That was always somewhat in place. It wasn't, there is a separation of, ethnic groups, but on the other hand, there's always that inner working as well going on throughout all of the Bible.
The Jews consider themselves to be descendants of Isaac, and the most of the Arab peoples to this day consider themselves to be descendants of Ishmael. So you do have this, unfortunately, a certain rivalry between the two, but also there's a certain common bond between the two as children of Abraham. And just in recent history, it's really interesting that I think it was brilliant that the American administration at the time chose to call these the Abraham Accords as these various Arab nations made peace with Israel, because both sides acknowledged themselves as descendants of Abraham.
Yep, some good persuasion there. But hopefully, I have some good persuasion for you to like, subscribe, hit the bell, join us in our read of the law, and feel free to comment on anything that we do, give feedback, questions. You know where we're going, Genesis through Deuteronomy. So stay on board, and we will see you tomorrow.